Something that I really appreciate this year about Pentecost is that, well, as you know, the celebration of Easter each day, the specific calendar day, is not the same every year. It kind of shifts around based upon a longstanding Jewish tradition that determines whether it's in April or March or somewhere in between. And this year, Pentecost happens to fall on this weekend, and that coincides with the graduation of our seniors, which was on Thursday evening after Living Christi. And it just has really helped me to appreciate in a deeper way why Pentecost is so important and what it's actually doing. Not unlike a graduation, not unlike any of the major chapter moments in our lives where something big comes to an end or something big begins again. The reason you all remember, perhaps if you're old enough, you remember the day that you graduated high school, or maybe the day that you graduated college, or the day that you were married. Think of something really big in your life. And why was that experience so meaningful to you? Why was it so meaningful for these 60-some seniors to graduate on Thursday evening? After all, if it were just the ceremony itself out of context, a bunch of people just put on some gowns and caps and walked across the stage. I mean, any of us could do that. I can put on a cap and a gown. I can walk across the stage. I can shake somebody's hand. But it wouldn't mean the same thing. Why? Because context is everything. Graduation is one of the most meaningful moments in these students' lives at this point in their life because of all of the context that preceded the moment of the graduation. All of the years, right, that they went through their education, all of the time they spent growing in friendship with their classmates, all of the challenges, the struggles, the losses, the victories, the triumphs, everything, the memories, the pictures, the photos, the vacations, the sports, the extracurriculars, the drama, everything is what fills their hearts when they come to the day of their graduation. And it's part of the reason that on the day that they graduate, and the day we go through these moments, we go through all kinds of emotions, right? We go through happiness, sadness, anxiety, hope, excitement, nostalgia, everything at the same time. And it is just rich and deep in its significance to us in such a way that it marks us. We remember it differently than we remember other days because of the scope of the entire story. When we celebrate the Feast of the Pentecost, something very similar is unfolding, in which we can't exactly appreciate what is being given on Pentecost unless we understand all of the backdrop. If we were to just walk in at the end of the movie and see the last scene, we'd be like, I have no idea what's going on. But we walk into the room and we see this scene and all the people watching the movie are like weeping their minds out. And I'm like, why are you guys all crying? Well, because they saw the whole movie and they know the significance of that moment. We listen to the recounting in the second chapter of the Acts of the Apostles, the moment itself when the Holy Spirit descends upon the apostles, the disciples, and the women gathered in prayer. How it enabled them not only to be filled with the Holy Spirit, but to speak in the languages of the world. And this, as we discover in that first reading, coincides with a bunch of people who already happen to be in Jerusalem from all over the place. And why is that happening? Because in the Jewish religion, they already were celebrating a feast called Pentecost. What we have in the Christian tradition in Pentecost, they already had in the Jewish tradition, Pentecost. In the Jewish religion, there were 3 times every year that every able-bodied man, and if he could, his family, his wives, they had to present themselves to Jerusalem for a major feast day. There were 3 of them every year in order to offer sacrifice and thanksgiving to God. One of them was the Feast of Passover. One of them was called the Feast of Weeks. And one of them was called the Feast of Booths, or the Feast of Tabernacles. And they coincided with the first fruits of the agricultural harvest throughout the year. The Passover coincided with the barley harvest. The Feast of Weeks coincided with the wheat harvest. And the Feast of Booths, or Tabernacles, that coincided with the grape and the olive harvest. And so you had to go and give God the first fruits of the very things that sustained your life. The Feast of the Passover commemorates what? The Passover from the story from Exodus, when they all slayed the lamb and they put the blood of the lamb on their doorposts. And on that night, the angel of death came through Egypt and killed all the firstborn, except those amongst the Hebrew people. And they fled that very night across the desert, through the Red Sea. And 50 days later, they end up at the base of a mountain called Mount Sinai. And when they were at Mount Sinai, Moses goes up to this mountain, which was filled with the glory of God and wrapped in fire and smoke. And he was on Mount Sinai for 40 days and 40 nights. And what Moses received at the top of that mountain was what? The 10 Commandments. Good job. The 10 Commandments. You fast forward 1,300 years, and in the city of Jerusalem, every year, they celebrate the feast of the Passover. Do they not? On the same day each year that the people of Israel, the Hebrew people, actually exited from Egypt, from slavery. And 50 days after Passover, the Jewish people come back to Jerusalem to celebrate the Feast of Weeks, the Pentecost, in order to celebrate what? The giving of the law on Mount Sinai. And so this is why Jews from all the nations scattered throughout the Near Eastern world are in Jerusalem for that feast. And they gather around this large noise from this house in the upper room and they were like, what is happening? What's going on? And they hear of this great deeds and the power of God in all of their native tongues at the voices of the apostles who have been filled by the Holy Spirit. You see, what's happening at Pentecost as we celebrate it as Christians is the culmination, the great epilogue, the great ending of the entire story, beginning from the very book of Genesis. We're in this moment of Pentecost where they're speaking in all the languages of the world in such manner that unites the peoples together, though they come from the four corners of the earth. As a recalling of the story of the book of Genesis and the Tower of Babel, when by humanity's own pride it seeks to build itself up and build a tower to the heavens to make a name for itself. And what does God do in that story as they build the Tower of Babel? What does he do to their languages? Yes, he makes languages. There was one language. They were made unto many languages. All of the people were divided in that story because they could no longer understand each other. Right? And that was the moral, that by human pride, when it exalts itself, it creates nothing but division in the end. And that story from the book of Genesis was brought back in this story of the Christian Pentecost to be undone so that the many languages of the world would come together again and be united as a human family. And in that story of Exodus, when people were freed from slavery into Egypt, that freedom from slavery is being renewed and fulfilled in this giving of the Pentecost, when by the Holy Spirit, people are freed from their slavery to sin in a way that was going to be definitive and new, like none before. And it recalls 50 days later as they go to Mount Sinai and they receive the law of God. One of the parts of the celebration of Jewish Pentecost, when they celebrated the Torah, the giving of the law, is they read from the Old Testament book of Ruth. And maybe you remember that story. In the book of Ruth, Ruth is not Jewish. She is a pagan. She is a Moabite woman. And she marries into a Jewish family. And in that story of great tragedy and loss, there is great redemption, where in the end, she stays with her mother-in-law, Naomi, and she says, "Your God shall be my God. Your people shall be my people." She turns from her worship of the Moabite gods to the worship of the true God. And so in the Jewish feast of the Pentecost, they read the book of Ruth as a reminder that the law of God was not just made for the Jewish people, but that it was to be given to all peoples, even identified by this woman of the Old Testament, Ruth, who became attached to the Jewish people, so much so that she became part of the lineage of the Messiah himself. And so there is this great celebration that in the giving of the law, God would give something to all people, even through his chosen ones, the people of Israel. And that being fulfilled now in the Christian giving of the Holy Spirit at Pentecost, where the new law of God is definitively given and enabled to be lived. Because if the law of Moses was enough, God would not need to give something new. But God promised that even after the law of Moses, he would give something even more. This was testified through the prophets, several of whose prophecies are being fulfilled in the giving of the Holy Spirit on Pentecost to the apostles. Like the prophecy from Joel, where God says, there will come a day when I will pour out my Spirit upon all flesh, and your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, and your young men shall see visions, and your old men shall dream dreams. And on that day, all shall come to know me. Like the prophecy from Ezekiel, the vision of the dry bones, where God places Ezekiel in vision before this whole sea of human skeletons. And he says, look out and see these dry bones. Prophesy to these bones, for I tell you, this is the house of Israel and the house of Judah. And as Ezekiel prophesied to this vision of bones, God sent by his power sinews and flesh upon them and formed them into human beings. And he said, prophesy to these human beings that my Spirit may come upon them. And Ezekiel did, and the Spirit of God came into the flesh and into the bones of this mass of people so that they became alive. And God said to Ezekiel, this is my people. They are dead like bones, and I will pour my Spirit upon all of them to make them alive in me again. And in this moment of Pentecost was the great prophecy fulfilled by the prophet Jeremiah. God spoke through Jeremiah during the time of the Babylonian exile, and through Jeremiah, God said, there will come a day when I make a new covenant with my people, not like the covenant I made with them of old, in reference to the covenant of Moses, the giving of the 10 Commandments. In that day, I will put my new covenant within them, and I will write this law upon their hearts. And no one shall have to go to his brother and say, come, know the Lord, for all shall know me, from the least to the greatest. And I will remember their sins no more, and wipe out all of their iniquities. All of these prophecies are being fulfilled in the life of Jesus, who came to bestow that new law upon the human race, most especially when he, in his paschal mystery, did this, suffered and died. And just before he suffered and died, at the Last Supper, he gave these very words to his apostles. He says, I give you now a new commandment. I write for you a new law. And what does he say? This is my new commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. And when he was resurrected from the dead, he proved that this law would not even be defeated by sin and death, but that it would be even more powerful than these forces that act upon our human nature. And for 40 days, in his resurrected body, Jesus taught with his disciples. He lived and walked with them. He ate and drank with them. He proved by many ways that he was truly alive, that death and sin no longer had power over him. And last weekend, we celebrated that stained glass window, the ascension. And if you recall, what did Father Chaz preach about in the ascension? That Jesus took our human nature, wedded to himself, to be forever and permanently raised to the glory, to the throne at the right hand of God in heaven. But in giving the new commandment and definitively giving the new law, Jesus said, wait and pray, and I will send my Spirit to you, which happened on this very day, on that Pentecost day, 50 days after Passover. And in the giving of the Holy Spirit, it wasn't simply that Jesus ascended with human nature to heaven. It is that he took divine nature and poured forth divine nature upon the earth. So that it wasn't simply just the humanity of Jesus in heaven, but the divine nature now wedded to all of our human natures across the face of the earth. You see, this was the final plan, the final victory of God, because in giving the mission, As we heard in the gospel, Jesus says, "As the Father sent me, I send you." This is your life. This is the life of every human being. Everybody has the same mission. It is the mission that Jesus received from his Father. As Jesus was sent, you also are sent. But Jesus knows that in order for you to fulfill your life mission, the moral law is not enough. The 10 Commandments are not enough. 10 Commandments which perfect us in our humanity, which help us to live a righteous moral life before God. That is not enough for us. In order for you to complete your life's mission, you don't just need a new command, you need a new nature. You need to have something that you don't possess. And this is why Jesus gives to all of us the indwelling of the Holy Spirit, so that what God is by his nature, we actually become as well by the impartation of his grace. You and I live not just a perfected human nature, but we live with the indwelling of the divine nature in us, wedded to us, like it is wed to Jesus in heaven, so that we can truly live not a human life on earth, but a divine life on earth, a divine mission on earth. And that divine mission was expressed in Jesus' life, which was poured forth by his divine mercy upon all of us. And this is why the first thing Jesus says when he is resurrected from the dead is, "Forgive sins, have mercy. What I did, you also shall do." And in order for you to do that, you actually need my life in you. And he gives that life to us in the indwelling of the Holy Spirit. All of these things are being fulfilled from the beginning of the human story and the great tragedy of the human fall through the centuries, completed in the life of Jesus and inaugurated now for us and poured forth into your hearts again and again and again, from now until the second coming of Christ and the completion of all of God's plan, when all things will be made one in him in the glory of a new heaven and a new earth. And so when we celebrate Pentecost, we don't just say, "Yay, we get to wear red." What is actually coming to pass is the culmination of every life experience you have ever lived and are ever going to live. And all of those individual threads are woven together and made one in this moment. Not simply to be made unified in themselves, but to be raised up by God in a supernatural way. Because when we begin to live the supernatural life, everything changes. It's the only way that a sinner can begin to live the life of a saint. It's the only way that a coward can become courageous. It is the only way that what is human can become divine. And it is the very gift that God pours forth in this celebration of Pentecost, the giving of the new law that raises us to something altogether greater. If you want to live your life's purpose, if you want to finish everything that you were ever created for, you cannot do it without this gift. Impossible. But if you have the indwelling of the Holy Spirit within you, and if we ask for a deeper capacity, a deeper share in the life of that Spirit, especially this day as we celebrate Pentecost, surely God will make us witnesses like his son Jesus was a witness. And just as it happened in his life, divine mercy will fall upon the face of the earth again and again, so that all that has been separated from God may return to him, made whole and transformed into what is divine.